think that is, we are live. We are live. Some of us in slightly warmer climates with a little less rain than others.
Some of us
rub it in.
Very jealous.
Yeah, I don't want to rub it in or anything, honest. Anyway, thank you for joining me at this time in the middle of the day, or for some of us it's in the evening, actually. Not quite the middle of the night, but it's certainly late. But yeah, so here we are. When men go quiet, tonight's theme, or today's theme. So I don't know, to sort of outline it, this isn't about blame. This isn't about, right and wrong. This isn't about men versus women. This is just about noticing what happens when things go quiet. Not about the right words. I used in my post earlier on, the example of my dad, who I would notice when he would go really quiet. He was carrying an awful lot of stuff. And so everybody else kind of altered their behaviour around him as a result. And I think that invariably means that you start predicting a behaviour that may or may not happen, but that can be quite dangerous. It comes, assumptions is something I know, Dan, you talk about, and the danger of assumptions. And Mark, too, you have commented before about how somebody came up to you and said, "Oh, are you okay? Because you're ever so quiet." And I think it's that we don't realise it, but we realise that there is something that has an impact to those around us. So I don't know, that's kind of where my head's at. I mean, I don't know. Throw it to you, Matt. Where are your thoughts on this? That what happens when men go quiet? And I mean, if I'm honest, I'm not sure it's just men. I think women do it. I mean, I certainly am very good at quiet when I'm processing stuff.
Sometimes it can be beneficial, I think, in terms of, I know that's not where we were going, but like I caught myself last night. My wife was panicking about locking the front door, making sure the front door was locked, and the judgmental me wanted to come out and say, "We're in Royal Tunbridge Wells. What the hell do you think's going to happen? Why do you need to shut the door?" I went zip and shut that view down. So sometimes it's beneficial for men to stay quiet. But yeah, I mean, it's, I think I've sort of said this before, that when men go quiet, it facilitates the wrong kind of behaviors. It enables and allows not the big horrific behavior, but the tiny little bits that lead to that.
I hear what you're saying, and I think it's that piece of, it's the build up. It's a little bit, and then it then is like, what happens then? It's almost like you're pushing the elastic band further and further and further, and then what happens at the point that it breaks? And it's in that piece where, at what point is it breaking? But I think that's true of everybody. I don't think that's necessarily just women. I've seen women exactly the same. And I think you're right. It's catching yourself. Something I know, Mark, you've talked about before, about catching yourself in that moment of, well, they should feel safe. And then you've gone, okay, well, why should they?
Mm-hmm. I'm just even feeling guilty of that and mentioning that there, and the amount of times I have a conversation with get given out for not locking the door. And I was like, it's fine. They don't need to lock the door. I'm here. It's fine. It's 4:00 in the afternoon. But to the point, like, I mean, just as Matt said, I just thought, why am I even arguing? Just lock the door. Like, it doesn't matter to me, But like, and that quiet piece, I think, is very interesting. I know I use it as an example often for how when I get stressed, I know I become quiet, and that's a sign that I'm stressed and that I'm anxious, right? And just as you're talking there, maybe think of that idea of leadership, and you can't lead quietly. Now, you can lead through action, and that does not mean you have to be loud, you have to make noise, but you can't lead by not doing or saying something. And so we have to lead ourselves in these spaces. And if we're quiet, then we're given no guidance to anyone else around us. We're given no direction to anyone else around us. Like if we are lead and make noise, not make noise as such, but we are vocal through our action to show and demonstrate the right thing to do rather than verbal, brilliant. But if we do neither, if we take no action and we say nothing, what are we really saying? Because even in doing that, and I know Dan has alluded to this an awful lot of times in terms of leaving WhatsApp groups and stuff like that, because, you know, in saying nothing, we are acquiescing to what's going on. We are approving in our own way, in a silent way. It's a silent nod of approval. And even if we bring it to that larger scale of saying nothing, we look at a world at the moment that's quite in turmoil, and it feels like the emperor has no clothes, and no one's willing to point that out because no one's willing to say anything. And you know, and so therefore this lack of using a voice or lack of taking an action always has repercussions. But we feel safe, but it's not about us. You know, it's probably a larger picture that we're not actually taking account of.
And I there's something that's gone through my head as you were speaking them off, and I you say that you feel safe, and I'm wondering, actually, is there a case that actually some men may not feel safe? I don't know, Dan, what, you know, where in the work that you do with men, have you seen places where their quietness is because of something internal that says they don't feel safe, as opposed to, you know, the narrative that Mark's saying, where, you know, actually he feels safe, and so what? There's an assumption that everybody else should feel safe. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, absolutely, Laura. Definitely. Men are always very concerned about their status, about where they are in the hierarchy, and about appearing weak. So if we're not too sure what we want to say, if we're not too sure whether we're going to upset someone or make ourselves look silly, we go quiet, we withdraw. I've done it myself. I've done it myself a number of times. I've gone, I don't really like where this conversation's going. And instead of standing up and saying, I don't like where this conversation's going, this is how I feel right now, I withdraw and I go quiet. And I think this is a problem in this area, in this particular area. You know, as Matt said, there are definitely times, and there are definitely times, as somebody who very rarely goes quiet, there are definitely times where I ought to shut the F up, right? And just get out of the way. But there are also times where it feels a bit awkward, where I'm not quite sure where I stand, but I've got an inner guidance telling me this isn't right, or we need to say something here. And I think we have a sort of a personal responsibility in this space when it comes to talking about being allies to women and girls, where sometimes, and we can preface it with, I'm not too sure about this, or this is where I'm coming from, so bear with me here. But then you've got to speak your truth, because again, as both the guys have alluded to today, silence is complicity. You know, if we don't stand up and say something, if we don't say this doesn't feel right, I don't like this, then, you know, we're agreeing to it. We're saying yes to it because we're not standing up and saying no. And yeah, often I think men feel unsafe, and probably not in the same way as women, where we don't feel like we can walk the streets at night, or there's certain places we can't go, and more kind of a psychological safety about how we're going to be seen and perceived, and whether our status and hierarchy is going to be reduced, especially amongst our peers or amongst a group that we're a member of, where we feel like actually the safer thing to do here is just to say nothing rather than to speak my truth.
So do you think a lot of how men, and I'm going to hold women in this piece as well, because I think there is a lot to be said for people who, how they might be perceived, decide to stay quiet rather than step forward and speak and everything. Of course, you know, that silence doesn't help. I'm not, not saying that, but that perception, I wonder, how much that plays. Michael's saying here, and this is very true, deciding to not act is an act in and of itself. Totally agree. It's that phrase, you cannot not communicate. And, so the idea that even if you don't actually say any words out loud, you are communicating in some way, shape or form with your body. And I think that is so true. I think we worry a lot about how we're perceived in front of other people and how people might interpret us. But you're right, those bits about, bear with me as I kind of work this through and have a try. I think it's having that sense of willingness to try and have that conversation, which is what I think you're alluding to, Dan, even if you don't know exactly what exact words are. It's the trying is better than to have not tried at all.
Yeah, and I think that this is all, men and women, it's all entirely natural human behavior. This isn't to sort of shame and say, oh, you're not talking, you're not speaking out, that's you should feel ashamed of that. It is entirely human and natural. I mean, it's speaking directly to the work of Steve Peters, the chimp paradox stuff. Your chimp brain, it's wanting to protect you, and it's telling you these messages. Oh, if you volunteer something here, if you say something here, it might get rejected, it might get shut down, it might be not what that other person wants to hear, it might impact your relationship with them. All of these messages will come straight away to your brain because of that chimp thinking of protect. So it's worth taking that moment and stopping, because it's about trying to allow your human brain to kick in, the one that's based on rational fact and thought rather than emotion. And yeah, that's then where conversations like this become so important, because when you investigate what is the fact, what is the actual situation here, that's when, if conversations like this are happening, you get to realize that, as we've just said, that inaction and not saying something is an action in and of itself, and you are being complicit, not with the big terrible things at the end of the path, but with the small little things that start to lead down that path. So it's entirely human and natural, and it's important that we take some time to stop and investigate that thinking and go, is that really true? Like, am I causing myself some threat here by speaking up? And even then, even when you investigate the fact, it can still be awkward. But yeah, letting that moment of sort of fear pass before going, oh, no, I'm going to keep myself safe and stay quiet here, can be very important.
I absolutely hear what you're saying. I think there's a couple of things that go through my head. One of my favorite phrases: we don't know what we don't know. That's everybody. So unless we start having a little bit of conversation, and in my world, might let my curly whirly brain kind of out loose to kind of work things through, then how will I ever know? That's true of anyone. But I think it, to your point, Matt, all of those little pieces, if we're not communicating or trying to understand, it builds, it compounds. It really does. Whether it is, that it's a external explosion, if that's the end of all of those, but something happens, whether it's internal and there is internal anxiety, but that build up happens if we're not talking. And I think that's, for me, I guess the danger is, if that's the right word, of not having and not trying to communicate along the ways, whether it is because that person ultimately becomes very ill because they're holding it all in because they're not talking, or whether it is because actually it is, worst case, a violent outburst, because that's the culmination of not being able to use Dan's word to talk your truth, because it is valid emotions, valid to them until you're discussing it. I don't know. Mark, thoughts?
I'm wondering, is a huge amount of the problem that we don't want to know, that there is a status quo that makes our life easier, although it's not quite fair, although it's not quite right. Do I want to know? Do I want to shake that up? Do I want to have to make a difference? Do I want to stand out? Do I want to step above, beyond, put my head above the parapet and open myself up? You know, and it's because I know, if I'm honest, right, and in the conversations I've had over the years, I know that I've come at them from the point of view of I know what I know. I'm not willing to accept what I don't know, and there isn't even anything that I don't know that I don't know, and therefore I can be righteous and I can be ignorant of any other part of that conversation because I know what I know, and I know what I know because my experience tells me that's fine. And I know there's times when I did not want to know the opposite, and I would get into a discussion about it, and then I'd have to kind of go, okay, I needed to see where was I there, and then I have to come back to it because I suppose my own desire to be right would probably be very demonstrative in the conversation. So I have to come back to it afterwards and go, you know what, I was wrong there. You know, I didn't see that, I didn't realize it, right? And maybe it took me a while to get to that point. But it's because I didn't want to be told I was wrong. I didn't want that. I didn't want to know that I didn't know things. I didn't want to know that there's a world of experience that I don't have. I didn't want to feel in any way less than from what it is. And I think that's a part of our huge problem in this entire conversation, because we don't want to know. Like, we actually don't want to know. Like, I suppose what nearly sparked that is, right? Sitting on my desk is a, oh, you can't see it obviously in the camera. It's a LGBT flag thing that I was at a gig a few months ago. And my friend gave us all these badges. Said, I want you to wear these badges at this gig. So fair enough, like, no bother to me. And I was just looking at thinking, if I wore that, that would annoy some people. I'm thinking but then the opposite. If somebody had I'm trying to think of a flag that's opposite. The old Confederate US flag as an example, right? That would annoy me, right? But what am I letting it, you know? So immediately I'm closed off, therefore nothing can happen. I'm just annoyed straight away all the time. And it's that kind of way that we're not open to the potential and the possibility and the learning and our place in all that. And until we shift into that space, we can't open up into how we can actually do it better.
That's such a good point. And I think, is it, because my brain's gone to this place of, is it just because we all want an easy life, or we're so, consumed in our own bubbles that actually it's just because we just can't deal with anything else that's going on. Michael has put that maybe because we are led to believe there is a right and a wrong. That is not necessarily true, but easier to process in a busy world. Absolutely, I'm totally with you. I very much have a belief that there is no right or wrong. It's just different. And I'm very much with you on that, Michael. I'm going
to slightly disagree with you there, Laura.
Okay.
It's a point that bears out the sort of discussion that we're having, because if you think it's okay, well, not okay. If you think the easiest path is to stay silent, and then you want to see the evidence of how that rolls forward, what's the outcome of that? President Trump is providing some very, very good outcome analysis of what happens. Like, did you see? I mean, it's obviously on a different tack. I mean, there was something else about a female reporter the other day. But did you see the thing about the Obamas as apes? Like,
yeah.
I mean, sorry, that's where I say that's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that is, I don't know. I suppose, yeah. I don't know, how would I differentiate that from where I see that there is a right and a wrong. I think it's when people say there is a particular way one has to do something. I mean, I grew up and was very much told this is what I had to do, and if it was wrong, if I didn't do it in that way, I was wrong. So I got to the point where it was so clear what was right and wrong that it was so fearful, should I get it wrong? But then I didn't, but that wasn't going to the place where you're talking about, which I just, so I'm in my head, I'm trying to work out that differentiation, because you're right, that's, is it morals? Is it values? Is it integrity? I think it's probably all of those that like touches,
I mean, I'd like to
so,
sort of say that it's someone along the way not seeing this earlier signs and saying, no, Donald, that's not okay.
well, and maybe the thing is that it's more about boundaries, in that sense. I don't know what the whole backstory. I only saw the headline. Of course, you know, we only ever see the headlines when we read the press. So I can't comment on the full context, I'm afraid. And funnily enough, here in Thailand, every single channel here is either in Chinese, Thai, or some other language that I can't speak. So I have no idea what's going on in the world. And
probably better, to be honest.
Yeah, probably.
You'd be able to get the BBC, Laura.
I'm sure I could find the BBC, yeah, in amongst all the Chinese and Thai channels. It's been the Thai elections, so therefore, you know, that's dominated. So, you know, even the BBC had to cover that.
But that opens up Laura, that opens up a very interesting point too, right? If we go right or wrong, and that's the thing that we're talking about here, right? Because I spent a lot of time in the Middle East many, many years ago, and everyone I spoke to who spoke to me about Ireland would tell me the BBC version of the events. And I was like, yeah, but that's not the version of events that I'm aware of, but that's the BBC version of events. What was right or wrong? You know, so that lack of objectivity is clear in every single thing. It's clear all. And you all said, oh, from the British Isles, oh, why did you? If you find the BBC, you'll find the news. You'll find that version of the news. So where's the objectivity piece in it, you know? So we always find the thing we know. We find that we find the thing that reinforces our worldview.
Yeah. It's all point of view, isn't it? There is no right or wrong. You know, Matt saying there, that's clearly wrong. And everybody sat on this call is going to agree with it. But there are some people that wouldn't. There's some people that say that's okay. And that's their perspective, right? But it's down to morals, values, culture. There are all sorts of things at play here as to whether we believe things to be right or wrong.
And so, to that point, then does that play into the narrative of them men wanting to stay quiet because they fear that, and then what's the impact then to everyone, you know, around them? I mean, I know, Dan, you talk about communication, and you know, the second part to my dad's story was, you know, what one thing that he wrote in he refused to have somebody to write his funeral speech, of all things, so he wrote himself. He said, I don't want anybody write like blithering on fires and end about, you know, he was this great man. He said, just get over and done with it, and so I'll write it for you. So, but what he did say in his like 3 sentences was, actually, you'll like this, Dan, was, you know, communication was the gift that we should all have, or words to that effect, and to forgive people quickly, because, you know, sometimes we don't always communicate exactly how we want it to come across, but forgive us for the fact that we've at least tried, words to that effect, which is playing to what we're saying. You know, you're saying is like, bear with me while I work this out, is what you're saying, Dan. And that was what he was saying. I know I didn't get it always right, but forgive me for the fact that, you know, I tried.
Yeah. And for me, it's not about what's right and wrong, right? It's about what serves. And in this space, right, what we all know doesn't serve is to let things fly, even if they're small. Sexist jokes, ways of talking about women, you know, and probably all three of us sat here have let things fly before. I've been in places and in groups and with other men, and things have been said and I didn't like them, but I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything about it. I would not behave that way now. And it's, you know, one of the most empowering things I ever did was stop feeling the need to be right. I spent my whole life wanting to be right. My dad taught me it's very important to be right. And one of the most freeing and empowering things I did was I got to the stage where I thought, it doesn't matter. It says nothing about me if I do something other people perceive to be wrong. That doesn't matter. You know, we definitely have some inherent fears as humans, right? We're tribal animals. We fear rejection and being ejected from the tribe, because back in the Stone Age that meant certain death, right? So it's in us, and we have to just recognize that and recognize it in ourselves. And I still get it today. I still see it in me, this wanting to be right, and I recognize and I know what that is, and then I act despite it, you know, feel the fear and do it anyway. Because what serves is to not let these things fly, is to create a culture where everybody feels safe, where everybody feels heard, where everybody feels included. That's what we all want, isn't it? Isn't it? That's what we all want. So that's what serves. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. That's what we want. So does it serve us to allow these minor discriminations and jokes and little things to go and laugh along? No, it doesn't. It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about what's the environment we're creating? What's the circumstances we're creating? We don't want violence, do we? We don't want people to feel afraid. We don't want our sisters and our wives and our mothers and our daughters to feel afraid. So we've got to do what serves, and what serves is to speak our truth and to say and to speak up when things happen we don't like and we don't want, but to do it in a way that's disarming. So I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong here, but I need to say something, and here's what I want to say. Start the conversation, and don't be afraid of being wrong. It's okay.
So is it as simple as that, you know, to say to people, you know, I mean, I suppose what I've gone to is this place of, you know, how do we get men to speak up earlier rather than later? You know, what is it that we have to do to change the narrative so that they do feel safe to speak up? You know, because what you're in your example there, you're saying was, you know, that realization for you that actually, well, if I was wrong, does it matter? But, you know, what else has to happen, you know, because not everybody will have that realization.
We need to not judge people. We need to not put people away if they do see something that doesn't come out quite right. We need to not shut people down when they offer an opinion on this stuff. Again, it's about creating the environment and the circumstances where it's okay. Like in my community, in the positive masculinity men's community, we don't shut each other down. We don't ridicule each other. There is no bravado, I'm right, you're wrong. You know, there are occasions where some of the guys say something and some of the other guys say, well, I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, and here's why. But it's done respectfully, and it's done in a way that means that whoever's offered that isn't going to feel like, oh, I'm shutting down, I'm withdrawing, I'm going quiet, as we've said here, because I feel I've been made wrong. Stop making people wrong. You know, we've talked about this before, haven't we? Calling people in rather than calling them out, and taking people aside and saying, here's what you said, here's how it landed, was that what you wanted? You know, and then you're opening up a conversation rather than and in a disarming way, rather than shutting somebody down or cutting them off or making them feel wrong.
You know, I think it's that space without judgment, you know, is crucial. But I mean, I guess, you know, what shuts a conversation down fast for you, Matt? You know, what? I mean, it can't just be because somebody's judged.
Well, if there's any conversation with an entire lack of curiosity, it's immediately going to be shut down, because it's just opinion versus opinion. It's just, this is right, this is wrong. It's to a point, it becomes a black or white conversation. And if there is no grey area, there's no middle ground. So therefore, we can't find a way to it. You know, when we've all been in discussions that became arguments with people where two people have taken a line in the sand. We've taken a position. You know, it's like, this is the position. That's it. Nothing can change from this point. And that doesn't bring us anywhere. It doesn't lead us anywhere, because it means that we're just, you know, digging bunkers, and it's, you know, warfare from this point, like, you know, and let's see if we can battle out for an inch here and there, as opposed to, right, well, let's meet in the middle and see, well, what's the difference here? You know, what is it that you feel and that I feel, and why do we feel such levelheads? Can we even agree to disagree so we can have a conversation and actually have a discussion on it? You know, the curiosity thing is so important. If there's no curiosity, then we can never get anywhere with anything. You know, if as a species, if we had no curiosity, you know, where would we have got? We wouldn't have left the sea. You know?
No, true. I don't know, Matt. What are your thoughts?
I think Mark's spot on with that, really. I mean, if you take the example of what I just said in terms of President Trump, there'll be people, therefore, that won't want to have a conversation with me, because they're like, oh, well, I clearly don't agree with you. We're not having a conversation. And if the conversation never starts, if I've been so judgmental that the conversation never even starts, then where are we going to get, right? So, yeah, as Mark says, the curiosity, because if you just approach it from the, well, that's wrong, you're not actually going to get anywhere.
I think that's so true. And it's something Michael has said here, is sometimes our own bias makes us jump to conclusions. Absolutely. We cannot be held responsible for how people interpret our comments. And on their second visit, we may realize our own perception was erroneous, not the original comment. You know, there's a phrase that the meaning of the communication is the reaction that you get. So that is, you know, that's the challenge, is, you know, if you get a reaction that you weren't expecting, then the way you communicated was not necessarily correct, in inverted commas. And sometimes we have to go back and repass, well, what did we do wrong in how that was landed? But I think curiosity is key. I think stepping into a space without judgment is equally key. I think this is true for anybody, whether you're a man or a woman, if I'm brutally honest. And I think it's, you know, back to your point, Dan, it's permission not to have the answer, to step into a conversation going, I just don't know, but I'm happy to remain curious to understand. But I think it's also an element of, you know, back to a bit about knowing our values and stepping into a conversation, knowing who we are. So we haven't just given ourselves away completely to that whole conversation, because it's can be easy then to come away from a conversation feeling that I haven't gained anything from being in that conversation, other than, I guess that's part of this thing, is people stay silent, stay quiet, because they're afraid they may lose part of themselves by stepping forward. I don't know, maybe that's contentious, but, you know, I think there are people out there who, you know, fear that they will be overwhelmed by people in conversation, and that they will not be heard, and therefore don't step into that space.
Yeah, this sounds like a great place to take this conversation next, Laura. Because it is, isn't it? It's about, because this is very much a moral issue, isn't it, that we're talking about here? It's about our values, and actually is sometimes the reason men go quiet, because we're not entirely sure who we are. We're not entirely sure who we are in relation to what's happening, what our value is in relation here, what choice and what decision we want to make therefore we don't make any. Yeah, I think this is a great place to pick it up next time.
And I think that's the big question, because I just think it is, if we don't know who we are, it's too easy to get drawn into the noise, and that in and of itself builds a frustration that keeps us quiet, that leads to silence, that leads to it, for want of a better way to describe it, bleeding out of us. It's almost like oozing, even though we're not actually saying anything. Sorry?
It has to go somewhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thing. But yeah, I think ultimately for me, it's, it's that whole thing of recognizing silence isn't apathy, that we're not always going to be perfect when we speak, and that the space has to be safe in order for people to step forward. And that's true of anyone. I don't know, closing thoughts as I allow you to the rest of your day, and I can go and sit and go and have whatever delight tonight's dinner is. We will see. Any closing thoughts, guys?
I think we tend to look at what we want from an outcome, and it feels like a very long, difficult journey, and it probably is in many respects. But we need to keep focused on what's the next step, and what's the next step, and what's the next step, and just so that we can start focusing there. Because I think for a lot of us, and kind of in line with the conversation we had today, when we talk about demanding people to change, it feels like a lot, because it's the end goal. We're looking at the finish line, but let's just put on our runners, and walk out the front door, and let's see where that takes us.
Yeah. And I think that's so true, Mark. I think it's like, we can't expect, a giant leap. It's the next step. And I know some of the conversations that, I've been having, I'm like going, whoa, that's great. But, that's a little bit further down. Next step. Otherwise the gap's too big, and then inevitably we're stepping forward into failure because the gap's too big to move forward with. So I think that's a very important point. Well, on that, absolutely, as Michael says, no journey is long and hard if you take it one step at a time. Absolutely, spot on. Without a doubt. Anyway, thank you as ever, guys. I look forward to next month's time TBC, but it will be the 10th of March. That is the day. So have a wonderful afternoon, folks, and I will have a lovely evening, hopefully avoiding the mosquitoes, but there we go.